Hello and welcome to another episode of Haga Plays. Judging by my previous videos, one might be under the impression that all I ever play is Nintendo, and that's all this channel is going to be about. After all, I've made one top list of N64 games and two videos covering the Nintendo Switch. Well, today I'm changing that by making this video covering the non-Nintendo games I'm looking forward to the most in 2017. A few rules before I start off. First, obviously, no Nintendo games allowed. Second, this list will only feature games that have been announced that we've seen something of. Thus, games like Star Wars Battlefront 2 and the next Need for Speed aren't quite eligible. And the last rule is no vaporware, like 90s arcade racer. So let's get this party started. The Nintendo 64 is my all-time favorite console. That's absolutely clear. No console before or after has had a roster of games that's kept me so happy as that wonderful little black box. Honestly, I was almost never jealous of what was available on other systems. The one exception of that is the Gran Turismo franchise. It's such a simple yet brilliant and ridiculously ambitious idea. Make a game which contains over 100 different cars, ranging from what your mom drives, or is likely to be driving, to the latest Le Mans racer, and allow players to earn virtual money to buy and upgrade them. I've spent God knows how much time playing the early entries with my friends, and while the first two games on the PlayStation featured somewhat wonky vehicle physics, that didn't really detract from the overall experience. And from Gran Turismo 4 and onwards, I believe that the vehicle physics have highly improved. I'm a big fan of this type of games, so I've owned both Sega GT and Forza 2, 3, and 4. One day, I'll probably get around to make a video showing off my most extreme creations in Forza. Anyhow, for the first time ever, I now own a Sony console, the PlayStation 4, not the Pro, so I'm definitely going to get Gran Turismo Sport. Especially considering that I now won't be able to play any of the Forza games. Judging by the trailers, GT Sport is going to continue the tradition of competing for which franchise is the biggest piece of car porn. There now seems to be a heavy emphasis on esport, and the game now has a livery editor, so you can give your cars a custom paint jobs just like in Forza. Something Gran Turismo has had for a long time, but Forza only ever has in the Horizon games, is rally racing. An odd addition is the so-called FIA Gran Turismo digital license. According to the official Gran Turismo homepage, players who accomplish certain tasks in the game will get a racing license, which is equivalent to a real racing license. So for those aspiring race car drivers out there, that should be a massive bonus. My one and only worry is the car roster. Where the last Gran Turismo game featured a jaw-dropping 1,200 cars, GT Sport is going to continue a far more modest 140 cars. Kazunori Yamauchi has however stated that the roster may increase to a more solid 400 or 500 through DLC, and considering how DLC was for free in Gran Turismo 6, we can assume, or at least hope, that that will be the case with GT Sport. One downside is, however, that the game supposedly won't feature quote-unquote standard cars. This means that the game likely won't contain many cars that are near and dear to me, like my first car, the Toyota Celica ST162. On this channel, I've been spending a lot of time talking about how much I like racing games, but you might be surprised to know that my top 3 favorite franchises are The Legend of Zelda, Mass Effect, and Shenmue. For those of you who aren't familiar with this franchise, it's a fairly unique action-adventure which takes place in the 1980s in China and Japan.
China, China, China. I have to have my China. China, China, because China, 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 China.
Shut up! The game was first planned for the Sega Saturn and would have been the by far best looking game for that system. However, due to Sega dropping the Saturn, they switched production over to the upcoming Dreamcast. At the time of its release, Shenmue had the highest budget of any game up to that point, and the wildly ambitious brains behind the franchise, Yu Suzuki, intended the game to consist of 14 chapters. The first game covered one chapter, and the sequel, which came out all the way back in 2001, featured an additional 3. With such a rich story, it was really frustrating to never get a conclusion. Well, thanks to Sony and probably one of the most successful Kickstarters of all time, they gathered the funds to make a new game in the franchise, now set to come out 16 years after the last entry. Considering that this game has nowhere near the budget of its predecessors, and developing games is considerably more expensive today than back then, realistically can't expect anything even remotely as groundbreaking as the original. It's going to be interesting to see whether Yu Suzuki hopes that this game will do well enough to warrant the sequels necessary to tell the remaining 10 chapters, or whether he's making one final game to wrap the story up and carry on to new things. The original game often receives flack for its English voice acting. While I didn't mind that at all, one thing that's got me slightly worried is that they might not improve the absolutely hideous voice acting from the Kickstarter video.
Bro, can you jump?
Yeah.
The first 2 Mass Effect games were my absolute favorites from the previous generation. They're the first games I've replayed multiple times since, well, Shenmue. The previous games engaged players, giving them the sense that the decisions that they made were unique and mattered. This was somewhat lessened by many decisions made by the developers for the third game. Andromeda is basically a fresh start for the franchise. The game seems to take place several hundred years after the last games. That means that you no longer play as Commander Shepard. Instead, you're an explorer who's out to colonize the Andromeda galaxy. That means that the game isn't really restrained in any way by the plot in the previous trilogy. I'm sure that some people will see that as a bad thing, but considering all the complex decisions players made in the last 3 games, it's really no surprise that the developers didn't bother to bring that over. It also seems like BioWare have taken all the most appreciated parts of all 3 games and shunned the things that weren't liked. An obvious thing I really like is the reintroduction of the drivable vehicles. The Mako was something I really appreciated in the original game, and the main thing I disliked with that was, frankly, the worlds that the Mako drove in rather than the Mako itself. The planet's surfaces just felt so barren and smooth. It's going to be an absolute thrill to get to know these new characters and see what direction BioWare are taking the franchise. Hopefully the worlds will be bigger and more open like the first Mass Effect. The next game could be considered cheating as it's been confirmed for the Switch. Rareware were my favorite developer for the Nintendo 64, more so than even Nintendo themselves. It's their consistent string of stellar releases for the console that made me want to become a game designer. And for those of you who don't know, Microsoft bought Rare soon after the launch of the GameCube, which basically meant that all Rare games slated for the GameCube, except for the almost finished Star Fox Adventures, got cancelled or moved to the Xbox. The company's really not been the same ever since. Well, a couple of years ago, a large chunk of the original Rare team reunited under the brand name of Playtonic Games. Needless to say, as an aspiring game designer and a true fan of their old work, there is no company in the world that I'd rather work for than Playtonic. Anyway, back to the game. Ukulele is a turn back to the games that I loved for the Nintendo 64. Open level design, lots of stuff to collect, lots of original and unique character abilities to master, and a buckload of minigames. The game is, however, not a time capsule where everything stood still for the past 20 or so years. These are professionals with a ton of experience, so they understand the shortcomings of their old games and the advancements that have happened in the industry over the past 10 or 15 years. The devs have promised bigger worlds than we experienced on the Nintendo 64, yet far improved level design which makes it more obvious where players are supposed to go. If this game does well, I'm definitely hoping for them to create an FPS that carries on the legacy of Perfect Dark and GoldenEye. Heck, with Activision not really doing anything with the Bond franchise anymore, wouldn't it be awesome if these guys got the honors? The first Red Dead Redemption was one of the most interesting games of last generation. While I do own Gun for the GameCube, I think that Rockstar's Cowboy game was, in comparison, an absolute marvel of a game. One thing I've often missed from the Grand Theft Auto franchise is a lack of a living rural area. Red Dead Redemption changed that by creating a massive, untamed wilderness, roaming with plant life and wild animals. So, when Rockstar announced Red Dead Redemption 2, I couldn't be more hyped. The previous game was fairly unique in that it took place just a few years prior to World War I. This meant that the game featured things like cinemas and early cars and semi-automatic pistols. It isn't clear exactly when Red Dead Redemption 2 will take place, but my hopes is that it'll be something like in the 20s, like the film Last Man Standing. It'd be cool if the game would feature a majority of the game world still stuck in the Wild West, where a majority of the people will still travel by horse and dirt roads and wooden saloons would dominate the cities, and generally people would just continue to dress like cowboys. And then players would be able to go into neon-drenched cities where everyone's wearing a suit and where cars are everywhere. Although that may be one step too far away from the roots of the franchise. For all I know, this could take place way before any of the games in the franchise. As of yet, we don't know too much, but Rockstar are perfectionists. They allow their games to cost as much as necessary as long as they turn out top-notch. So whatever decisions they make, I'm sure that this game is going to blow me away. So, those were the 5 non-Nintendo games I'm going to look forward to the most in the year 2017. This is shaping up to be an astonishing year, at least from my perspective, considering that my favorite franchises, Zelda, Mass Effect, and Shenmue, all are getting brand new entries this year. Now, if there could only be a new Perfect Dark. So, please let me know what you're looking forward to the most in the comment section below. And of course, please share, like, and subscribe. And have a good week. This has been Jacob Holgerson, signing out. Cheers.